Nicole, thank you for talking to me, for the students, particularly at Waterloo, and helping them understand the work that you've been doing. You've written a book called The Smartphone Society, Technology, Power and Resistance in the New Gilded Age. And that work focuses on what you think can be done to create a better world, particularly around technology. Uh, can you just begin by giving an introduction to the students to tell them about the work that you do today?
Sure. So I'm very happy to be able to talk to your class, Peter, and I want to thank you for inviting me. I really enjoy talking to students, even though I don't I'm not actually able to see you, but I'm happy that I'll be able to have you as my interlocutors. I'm trained as a sociologist, and I actually taught for a number of years at Boston University. I taught sociology there. And my part of my interest in smartphones actually comes from talking to my students and seeing what an important device smartphones were to them. So I often would think about ways of describing global value chains and social norms using the example of the smartphone. So it definitely spurred some sort of fruitful idea and hypothesis generation for me. But I actually left teaching a few years ago to help run Jacobin magazine, where I was the managing editor for a few years. And I also, have been writing sort of for a popular audience for some time. And this is my second book, really with the idea that I wanted to dig into the question of how technology is being used in our society from a sociological perspective, right? To think about issues of privacy, surveillance, work, democracy, from a sociological perspective. And there is actually a lot of great work from sociologists thinking about technology. So it was really fun to dig into some of that, but also to really dig into some areas that were new to me. So trying to understand, machine learning and, what these tech companies are really doing. So it's been a really exciting project, and I'm happy now to be able to share it with all of you.
And I very much enjoyed reading it. I thought it was very rich, and the following through the various elements that you were discussing was I thought very easy to do and very interesting. But so your book's based on the changes that are happening today. You've described that, particularly focused on the smartphone. One question that I think is very important, it's useful to consider at the beginning of our discussion, is what you believe the direction, or how you believe the direction of technological development is determined. What is it that causes technology to develop in the way that it does?
Well, I think you started out by framing the question perfectly there, Peter, which is not to put technology in the driver's seat, which I think is a big mistake that we often run into. And we sociologists refer to it as technological determinism, but it's something that's really rampant. The sense, and it's almost kind of a natural impulse when you have a new technology, such as the smartphone, to use it as the kind of explanatory variable to talk about a lot of changes happening in society. When I think it's much more useful to see technology as reflective of the social and economic and power relations that exist in society. And so that when we want to understand how technology develops over time, we have to keep in mind that we need to embed it in these social relations and to understand, whether it's a piece of machinery or a whole system of technology, we need to understand it, in relation to society, right? Not to put it outside of society as if it's acting upon society. And this is sort of a simple point, but it's one that's often overlooked, or people will sort of nod along with, then after a few moments immediately flip into a sort of technological determinist frame. So one of the things that I really tried to do in this book is really keep my sociology hat on and really keep in mind the kind of social relations, and to use in this case, the smartphones as a kind of window into the changes that we've seen in technology over the past decade or so, and also a window into where we think society might be headed.
Yeah, I thought the way that your book did this was very interesting. You started by talking about how the automobile could be viewed in a similar way in the past when it first appeared, and the impact that it had had on society, and how people had used it to do various things. And at that, you then went on to say, argue the smartphone has that type of role today. Presumably you could have picked other technologies maybe as well, but why did you especially think that the smartphone was the one to go for? I think it's a very useful tactic in explaining what you're seeking to explain in your book, but I was intrigued as to why the smartphone particularly.
Well, I think that what's interesting, and you're right, I'll say a little bit about the auto industry and sort of why I started with the automobile. And I think part of the reason why I use that example is, well, one, I used to study the automobile industry quite extensively. That's what I wrote my PhD dissertation on. So I really had a sense of both the history and also sort of the kind of relationships that emerge and the automobile is embedded in, but also how we can look at a lot of different processes by looking at the car, right? We can better understand things like financialization and globalization through understanding how cars are produced and regulated and used. And when we think about, all right, many people argue that the car was kind of the defining commodity of the 20th century when you think about all the ways that society becomes shaped around the car. And I was thinking, all right, well, what would be a kind of similar machine today? And the thing that immediately popped into my mind was our smartphones. Here's a device that within, a little bit less than a decade, if you look at the first standalone study of smartphone use in the United States, it was a Pew study from 2011. That's a time when roughly a third of Americans had a smartphone. That's not very long ago, right? And we think about it now, young people, nearly 100% of young people in the United States have a smartphone, right? Nearly 80% of all Americans, including adults of all ages, have a smartphone in a very short period of time. Not only do we own one, but we carry them with us everywhere. When I talked a little bit earlier about, well, we can't, we have to resist this kind of technological determinist impulse. The point there is not to say that there's nothing special about technology or that technology is not worth studying, right? Certainly, we can't chalk up everything about particular technologies and their impacts to broader social structures. And the smartphone is an example of how this particular technology is quite amazing. Not only in the sense that it's an everything device and it provides us all of these conveniences, but in a broader sense that it is, if we situate it in the Internet of Things, this is sort of the biggest, most important artifact in this whole universe, right? In the sense that it is creating and generating and transmitting personal data about us 24 hours a day, every day of the year, everywhere we go. And this is unprecedented. And even more interesting than this, the ways that when you start to sort of, look at your smartphone, the ways that we produce and use and regulate and dispose of our smartphones really tell us a lot about how society has evolved over the past decade. So I think it's a really fruitful way of understanding kind of bigger changes.
Yeah, I thought it was very effective to, help people to get a micro view of the changes that were being made almost. You got one thing you're considering, but then it allows you to introduce a whole range of areas that really help you to understand the overall impact of technology. And I thought it was a great technique. One area that you looked at particularly was democracy and the impact that the smartphone had there. And I thought it'd be useful if you talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, when people think about smartphone and democracy in the same sentence, we don't always have a good picture that comes to mind, particularly, right now we're in the lead up to determining who will be the Democratic nominee for the next presidential election in the United States. And certainly if we think about the 2016 election, conversations about, the dangers of algorithmically determined politics or fake news, or people, if we think about this concept of, Eli Pariser's concept of the filter bubble, right, where we each have our sort of own uniquely constructed universe where we just see whatever we want to see. We start to have all of these conversations and we think about, maybe the relationship to technology is not so great. And I think that some of those critiques have real value. But I also think that our smartphones are providing a much more interesting kind of political tool. And they have a much more interesting relationship to the political landscape around us. And one of the things that we see emerging is that a lot of the, nascent political movements, whether they're progressive or right-wing or feminists or based on, sort of environmental concerns, this kind of digital connection, particularly to, social media, it is integral to the ways that people are making and doing politics these days. And we see a kind of new political model emerging where people are sort of simultaneously, on the ground, knocking on doors, calling people up on the phone and organizing in more traditional ways, but they're also spreading the news, spreading their ideas and developing social networks digitally. And so I think that, rather than just, succumbing to, algorithms or technology are destroying democracy, it's much more interesting to ask the question of how are we actually using this new technology in our politics, right? In the ways that we're organizing.
Absolutely. And that's one of the areas that we look at in the course that the students that you're speaking to will have thought a little bit about. And of course, there are many areas there to consider. And we're going to talk a little bit about those, I think, in the questions coming up. But and I guess that is partly involved in my next question, which is around the impact that technology is having on power and inequality in society. You discussed that, I think, very effectively. And really the question that I had was whether you think technology is improving the lives of people who have less power, or whether it's increasing division.
Well, that's a great question and a difficult question. And I don't think that there's a cut and dry answer. If we think about, the architecture of our phones, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit more, certainly the ways that tech companies have designed our phones and are using our phones, particularly maybe a company like Uber, is not exactly empowering, people or creating good jobs. Right? If we think about the kind of working class of the 21st century and how that's developing in relation to technology, a lot of the technology we develop, and this is not just smartphones, right? This is scheduling software, this is automation in plants. They're being used to actually squeeze more out of workers and pay them less. So in that way, I'd say technology is not really helping people. But if we think about technology as a tool that people are using and repurposing for their own ends, right? We can never predict how technology will be used by ordinary people. We see a lot of really exciting things, one of which I just mentioned was the use of smartphones and social media and live streaming as ways to fight for justice and, actually organize. And we see it, in actually, union organizing drives, when Uber drivers are linking up with, more traditional taxi drivers and other app workers to get legislation passed to, pay them a living wage. Here we see that technology is being used as a tool. So I think we need a kind of nuanced understanding and a kind of broad-based sort of understanding of power, so we can see how technology is being incorporated into, both the profit-making strategies of companies, but also the kind of liberatory organizing strategies of unions and social movements.
Absolutely. And so you're arguing there that although technology may be contributing to widening of inequality, at the same time it's being used by people who are opposed to that inequality and trying to reduce it as a tool that will help them campaign and do things that might reduce it. So, so there's that tension and that appears there.
Yeah.
You also talked in your book about the growth of the tech companies themselves, of the big tech companies, and you talked a bit about the influence of that. But you especially referred, I thought, to neoliberalism as one of the dominant political approaches that exist today. And the relationship between that and the tech companies. And I was interested in what you meant by that and how you saw that perhaps changing today, because I think you hinted or you said that you thought that was changing.
Yeah, so I think, neoliberalism is kind of a sloppy, broad term, but sociologists in particular use it, or we could say neoliberal capitalism, right, as a kind of variant of capitalism. We use it to describe a set of ideas and practices. So some of the core ideas of neoliberalism, particularly this idea that markets are natural and we should, sort of let them emerge and evolve and not weigh them down or try to overregulate them with state, regulations and laws. These kinds of ideas are very old. They go back to the 17th century. Most of the time, what people mean when they say neoliberalism is this kind of political project that emerges in response to the crisis of the 1970s, which is really a pushback against Keynesianism and a real reorientation of both ideas and practices regarding what the role of the state in the economy should be, right? A new set of ideas emerges that really kind of lionizes this idea of a company-led economy, right? This, Reagan's famous saying of getting the government off the backs of the people, right? This idea that states should deregulate, they should privatize, they should prioritize market-led solutions, and also that companies should not have to worry so much about all of the stakeholders in their orbits, and rather they should focus on, shareholder value and really focus on profit making. And if they do that, this will automatically kind of benefit society as a whole. And we also finally see a lot less suspicion of companies in general, right? Less suspicion about companies getting too big or gaining a monopoly over their respective marketplaces, or really looking at sort of what their strategies are in terms of their impact on the communities around them. So if we think about this climate of ideas and practices that emerges, really beginning in the kind of the late 60s, but really taking hold in the 70s and becoming kind of the norm in the 1980s, we can make sense of how it is that we have these enormous tech companies today, right, that each pretty much have a monopoly in their respective, and I'm talking about companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, right? These companies have a monopoly in their respective marketplaces, and they've really been allowed to develop with very little federal oversight. And they've been allowed to shape their kind of industries as they see fit. So really only in the past few years has there been a kind of growing call to really take a harder look at these tech companies and to start to ask, real difficult questions about what their role in society is and what our role should be and can be as consumers and regulators.
Which is a question that seems to be getting bigger at the moment. Elizabeth Warren was questioning that, particularly with her billboard in San Francisco. saying the tech companies were going to be broken up. And there are various policy discussions in different countries around how this question needs to be tackled. It'll be interesting to see what does get resolved on it, but it does seem to be something that more people are worried about than used to be.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and part of what they do, the big tech companies, is they collect and use data. People's awareness of that and their concern about privacy also seems to have grown. You talk about that in your book, particularly from the point of view of this being part of the pursuit of profit that the big tech companies were engaged in, that this was a new area of exploitation maybe, or a new area of value for them. And I thought that that was a useful approach to it, and was interested in you perhaps explaining that and how people's concerns about that might be addressed.
Yeah, so one of the kind of core tensions I examined throughout the book is this contradiction between, what an ordinary user hopes to gain when they pick up their smartphone, and what these tech companies hope to gain when they design the architecture and software of our phones. And I say that there's a real contradiction between these impulses. When an ordinary person picks up their phone, for the most part, they're using their phone for information, to connect with people in their networks, for entertainment, to find where they're going. These kind of not mundane, but certainly not sort of activities that are geared toward profit making, right? Unless they're using their phone to make money through some type of app work. For the most part, people are using their phones to make their lives better and to increase joy and education and connection. When we think about what tech companies are hoping to gain from our phones, right? The sort of, when we imagine this connection between ourselves and these companies, which is mediated by this device that we carry with us everywhere, we see that they have different ends in mind, right? Certainly they want to keep us attached to our phones, so they create fun apps and software, but their end goal is to make a profit, right? And which makes sense because we live in a capitalist economy, and that's perfectly understandable. But when we think about the sort of implications of this, right? We're carrying this phone around with us everywhere, this device that's constantly generating an enormous amount of data about each of us personally. And this data is being scooped up and, slotted, and we're being characterized, and, very detailed profiles about each and every one of us is being sold to who knows who, right? To advertisers and gray market data companies. And so this contradiction, right, between what we're hoping to get and what tech companies are hoping to get out of this device is something that I think we don't spend enough time thinking about. Often when we're talking about our relationship to our smartphones, the conversation gets framed either around, addiction, like we spend too much time on our phones, or our phones are making us dumb, right? This kind of very much this kind of classic approach where we're thinking about this kind of mind-body divide, right? We're worrying about our authentic selves, and we're also framing it in a very individualist sense, right? In the sense that we're expected to personally manage how we use our phones, and there's a lot of shame and guilt that goes along with that, right? In these conversations, we're becoming narcissistic, these kinds of conversations. But increasingly, we're also expected to manage our privacy, right? This idea that, well, it's your fault if you are not setting the right privacy settings, or it's your fault that you are not aware of the dangers. And I think both of these kind of framings are not helpful, considering that everyone is carrying this device around with them. And most of us are not actually aware of the amount of data that's being collected by these companies, right? So when we start to really think about this relationship, it's significant. And I argue in the book, actually, that it's not only significant in the sense that it's made these companies, like Facebook and Google, extremely profitable, but it's actually much beyond these couple of big companies, right? It's a whole new frontier of capitalism. And it's this, we have a new relationship that's evolving, right? Where it's expected and it's become the norm that all of this data about us is available and is being hoarded and sold and used to develop algorithms that are actively right now being used to shape society. So this is a really big part of the book for me, to really shine a light on this kind of dynamic and encourage people to be aware, right, of what's actually happening around them.
And that awareness perhaps might contribute to what you talk about next in your book, I think, which is the extent to which the smartphone is enabling a new politics that might contribute towards the end of neoliberalism. And, this would clearly be a substantial change. And something that you argue the smartphone would have a significant contribution to make within. So I was interested in whether you would talk about that.
Yeah, well, I guess if we pick up on a little bit of our earlier conversation, since the 2008 financial crisis, this idea of neoliberalism or neoliberal capitalism, which was kind of the normative way of organizing society for the past 3 decades, has really fallen into, a legitimacy crisis, I guess is how I would describe it, right? When we think about people's belief that the way that we're organizing society is producing the best outcome, people are believing that less and less, right? We see a widespread lack of trust, both of mainstream political parties, but also of other types of institutions, right? Including scientific institutions and the government agencies, right? The ability, people really have less faith in the ability of the kind of managers of the status quo to actually provide a good life. This is a broader crisis, right? This is not a crisis that's generated from technology or from our smartphones in particular. This is a crisis that is sort of pervasive across society, and it relates to the kind of contradictions of the economic model that has developed over the past 30 years, right? Part of neoliberalism is really this kind of squeezing of ordinary working people for the benefit of the elite, which is, sort of a crude way to put it. But if we think about the skyrocketing inequality in line with this kind of increasing distrust, we start to get a sense of this landscape of political unrest. It's not just in the United States, but is all over the world. So part of what's I think if we're thinking about the kind of political dynamics that are emerging, initially it was these kind of tech companies that seemed like they were doing something better and more interesting and more people-centered. But I think in the past few years, there's been a growing awareness that the dynamic that I was just talking about, the sort of 24/7 surveillance, both from corporations, but also from governments, right, who are also using our devices to surveil us, is part of capitalism, right? It's not sort of outside it. And so people are linking up and understanding the sort of profit-making drives coming from Silicon Valley, and they're linking that up to other, kinds of more traditional capitalist countries and companies, excuse me. So it's not this kind of bright, beautiful future. I think there's sort of a growing realism, about the kind of dynamics that we're seeing in society.
So you described 3 principles for what we can do about all this. So I thought I'd ask you what those were and why you think they are important.
Well, I don't think that these principles, I set out these principles as a way of sort of formulating some demands for what we want. And I should preface that by saying as people become more and more aware of, criticisms they may have of technology, or feelings or misgivings about carrying their phone around with them everywhere, or, what the impact on young people and children will be, that we have this, 24/7 connected society, and they become uncomfortable with these dynamics. I think a lot of times the impulse is just to say, well, throw your phone in the garbage, stop using the internet, stop using social media. And I think that that's not a realistic or even necessarily a desirable impulse. It's an understandable impulse, but I think, we should push back against that. And part of the reason why is because, particularly in the United States, for a lot of poor people, their smartphone is their only connection to the internet, right? It's easy to say, well, let's throw your phone away when you have, any number of other ways to connect to the internet, right? I believe the internet should be a human right, right? So you can't say then that we should get rid of the main ways that not only in the United States, but people all over the world actually connect with each other and to information, etc. So when we think about, all right, well, what are some ways that we can actually think of building a better relationship with technology? I started to, draw together some of what I had learned, to lay out some general principles to, then together, right? Because it's not, these are the sort of blueprint for the future is not going to come from one person. It should come from everyone, and particularly not just academics or venture capitalists or software engineers, right? It should come from the ordinary people who are using this technology, and also whose sort of appropriated and unpaid labor is generating all the data that's actually going into the kind of algorithms and software that are shaping our society. So the first principle that I said was that our phones shouldn't be used to perpetuate and obscure coercive and unjust relationships. And this is a broad principle, but it refers to a number of things. So for example, earlier I mentioned Uber drivers. This is an example of a coercive and unjust relationship, in the sense that app workers more broadly are being classified as independent contractors with no rights to minimum wage or sick pay or even basic workplace protections. This is starting to be challenged in California, thankfully, but this is something that we really have to think about, right? What are the relationships that we're generating through all of these new kind of app jobs? And we can situate that in a longer history of outsourcing and subcontracting in, manufacturing and service work in general, which is often done at the expense of workers. But another way, if we think about coercive and unjust relationships, we can also again bring up the issue of privacy, right? And really, I'm really advocating for us to have a much more robust conversation about privacy, and to bring that back as something that's considered valuable, and that we need an updated understanding of privacy, right, for this kind of digital age that we're, hurtling towards. And also, along with that comes a conversation, about free speech, right? And thinking about, well, who is policing free speech and protecting privacy, and advocating for us to not allow tech companies to be the arbiters of free speech, right? To actually say, we as a society should be defining what we want free speech to be, rather than allowing a company like Facebook or Twitter to make the rules about what counts as free speech. So those are some of the things that I was really trying to think about in the first principle. The second principle was that we shouldn't use our phones to mask bad, selfish, or immoral behavior, which this is a little bit mushier, but I think it's also important, right? When we think, and here again, I have my sociology hat on, sociologists are very interested in norms and how they change over time. So some of the, things or the bad behaviors that we associate with smartphones are not necessarily things that would be regulated by laws or something that's subject to sort of police control, right, or regulatory control. But that doesn't mean that they're not important. So if we think about one of the examples that really stuck out to me was that in Silicon Valley in particular, actually, many of the families and parents who work at these tech companies don't allow technology into their homes, and they make their nannies sign no phone contracts, which basically say that they will not subject or allow the children in their care to ever see a phone, which means the nannies can't use the phones themselves, right, during the day to call their own children. And in Silicon Valley, there are actually message boards where other people will post photos of nannies using their phones to either out them or shame them. So here we see an example of some very bad behavior associated with their smartphones that we should develop some norms about. Another very simple thing is just filming people without their permission, right? These kinds of things. Or, you know, we can think of many different types of phone behaviors. And part of this is just that this is a new technology, and we are right now sort of working out the norms. But I would encourage people to develop and talk about, well, what is acceptable phone behavior and what isn't, right? And this can be something as simple as, not filming people without their permission, or it can be really looking at our own behaviors with our phones, right? And something as different as what are our behaviors around consumption, right, and purchasing, right? When we think about how easy it is, it's almost it's so easy to purchase things through our phones that we often don't think about it. Right? It becomes almost unthinking. And so to reflect on kind of what our own behaviors are with our phones and how this might be impacting society and the world around us negatively. And the last principle was a positive principle rather than a should not principle. And it was, our phones should be a pathway to a true digital commons where life isn't for sale. And here is where, again, I'm really trying to emphasize in the book, this isn't an anti-technology book. In fact, I think that, even our smartphones are pretty wonderful. The internet is amazing, and these things can be really powerful tools and resources for us if we, take control over them, right? If we say that our phones are for the people, right, and not for corporations, which is a sort of crude way of defining what this kind of power relationship should be. And we can, if we think about how technology has developed, right, over time, we see that actually it's been a very collective endeavor, right? Whether it's through taxpayer-funded research or government agencies, and not to mention all of our unpaid labor that goes into creating the algorithms and software that we rely on, right? It's been a collective endeavor, and we should share in this kind of wealth of technology together and create a commons that benefits everyone and not just a handful of really large tech companies.
So my last question is about what the future might hold, but hopefully where those principles are applied more than they are today. But you described the current, organization of society as a map. And I was interested in what you thought that map might look like in the future as a result of technology, particularly, I guess, for the people who will be watching this. What sort of world do you think they might expect that they'll be living in after they graduate?
Well, I used this, the last chapter, I used this idea of the map, and in particular, I use this idea of a cognitive map, which I borrow from Frederick Jameson, who's actually not a sociologist. He's a literary theorist. But his idea of, cognitive mapping is sort of allowing yourself, and here I use the smartphone to do this, but to give us a sort of sense of the totality, right? To give us a sense of what the economic and social and political totality is, right? All of this is kind of this is some sort of high theory, but if we imagine our phones, we really can see how they encapsulate these relations. And when we look into it, we can see things that we didn't see before. And which is, some of the stuff that we've talked about already in this conversation. But part of, this exercise of cognitive mapping is not just to see the world more clearly, but also to change it. And so the last part of the chapter of the book, looks at sort of movements to actually tackle some of these questions related to digital technology in particular, right? Not just sort of broader political movements, but movements to actually, fight back against privacy abuse, to try to limit surveillance, to try to think about the ecological footprint of our ICT industry, which is often kind of glossed over, and really to, take a harder look at some of the jobs and work relationships that we're building, both through our smartphones as, kind of app jobs, but also, the bigger technology companies themselves as places to work, right? When we think about the types of jobs that those companies are creating, everything from blue collar tech jobs to content moderators who are essential to social media, and but we never even see these kinds of workers, right? They're kind of invisible. So, there are a lot of groups actually working right now that are really different from each other too. We have sort of labor unions and tech worker coalition, and the ACLU, which is a more traditional union, ProPublica. We also have organizations like the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is working to increase access to broadband. We have a whole, and this is just, in the United States, but, globally, we have a whole sort of upsurge of, organizations and individuals and experts and regular folks who are trying to actually get a hold of this kind of digital future. And I think that that's really exciting and important, right? Particularly, in the sense that we can link these kind of movements up together, right? So that they're really representative of the needs of, everyone. That said, I think we have to really be cautious and be cognizant of the power of tech companies in particular to kind of shape the debate about what kind of changes we need. Right now, I think a lot of work that's being done is really good, particularly, in relation to, work and surveillance, but I think it needs to actually push a little bit further and look a little bit harder at the kind of business models that tech companies have, and actually really challenge this basic premise, which is that our data, our personal data, is collected and sold without our understanding or our permission all the time, right? So really, I would encourage your students and younger people in general to really, think hard about this kind of relationship and to formulate demands that really go a little bit deeper than just kind of nibbling around the edges of tech companies' business strategies.
Yeah, the thing I really liked about your book was that although it starts small, if you like, because the smartphone's really small, and you think when you first look at it that maybe this is just about what a smartphone does and how it changes people's lives. It really is opening up a big window, or it's a big window that you look through to understand how technology is affecting the whole world and how all of that fits together, and what the implications of all of that integrated use of technology, what it's doing in people's lives. And I thought that really, to me, was the great value of your book, that it helped people think about that as a whole from a starting point that is reasonably accessible and easy to understand. So, it's been very useful that I've been able to talk to you and that you've been able to explain this to the students who'll be watching. So, I'm grateful to you for taking the time to do it.
Well, thank you, Peter. And I'm really happy that you read the book and you got something out of it. And I'm happy to talk to you. And I really appreciated your thoughtful questions. And I appreciated the opportunity to talk a little bit more about my book.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.